Here's an experiment for you. Take passionate experts in human resource technology. Invite cross-industry experts from inside and outside HR. Mix in what's happening in people analytics today. Give them the technology to connect. Hit record. Pour their discussions into a beaker. Mix thoroughly. And voila, you get the HR Data Labs podcast, where we explore the impact of data and analytics to your business. We may get passionate and even irreverent, but count on each episode challenging and enhancing your understanding of the way people data can be used to solve real-world problems. Now, here's your host, David Turetsky.
Hello and welcome to the HR Data Labs podcast. I am your host, David Turetsky. Like always, we try and find fascinating people to talk to inside and outside the world of human resources to bring you up to speed and the latest on what's happening in HR data, analytics, technology, and process. Today, like always, we have with us Dwight Brown, our co-host. Hey, Dwight, how are you?
Hey, David, I'm good. How are you doing?
Very good, thank you, sir. And our old friend, Kevin Campbell, employee experience scientist from Qualtrics. Hey, Kevin, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back on.
It is a pleasure to have you on again, sir. It was fun the first time. I think we'll probably repeat that again this time. But for people who don't remember you, can you give us a little bit about your background?
So I'm an organizational psychologist by training, and I'm a recovering consultant. I worked as a consultant with the Gallup organization and Deloitte, and I had my own practice for a period of time. And now I've gone more into the tech world. So I worked as a people scientist for Culture Amp, and now I currently serve as an employee experience scientist for Qualtrics. So working on our internal advisory team on helping our customers go from where they are to where they want to be with regard to their employee experiences.
Fascinating stuff. And that's the reason why we love talking to you, because you've got an incredible background and you have an opinion, and we like it. So, Kevin, one fun thing that no one knows about you until now.
I already gave my one fun thing last time, and I don't know. I don't know if I have to.
You must. Come on.
So, it's interesting because this is something that everybody knows about me, and nobody knows about me at the same time. So we've only met virtually. We haven't had the pleasure of meeting in person yet. But if we had, you might be able to see that I have a scar on the back of my head. A good amount of the time, my hair covers it up, and as I've gotten older, fewer people ask about it because as I start to lose some of that hair back there, it just sort of blends in with everything else. But when I was a kid and people would ask me how I got the scar, I would always say it was from a surfing accident because that sounded much cooler than the real which was my mom was a dog groomer when I was a kid, and sometimes those dogs had nasty things like ringworm.
Oh my gosh!
Embarrassing. But as I've grown older and wiser, I tend to care less about what people think. So if it comes up, I just tell people the truth.
So it isn't like 666 or like a lightning bolt. So you're not either Damien or you're not Harry. So
no, that would be a great story, by the way. But I might lose some friends in the process of doing that. So
yes, or you might get a new show on television about you never know. So one of the cool, fun things we get to do, especially with people like Kevin, who are geeks like us, who really think about the intersection of data and analytics in HR. So we get to talk about how we should think about HR programs. Today, our topic is going to be program evaluation and program effectiveness. And because we're heading into what might be a recession, certainly some kind of slowdown, we're going to be talking about how lean budgets are going to be on the rise for HR and how you can evaluate your programs and program effectiveness. So, Kevin, how have we actually gotten to where we are in HR with program spend? What led us to where we are today?
Hey, this is William Tincup. Listen, we did a series for iSolved called Heroes of HR, where we talk to HR practitioners. And these are just your run-of-the-mill, everyday, slogging it out, 300 employees in Cedar Rapids. HR pros. Mostly it's centered around iSolved and what they do with iSolved, but also they talk a lot about kind of the day-to-day rigor of HR. If you're curious about that, search for Heroes of HR wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.
I think the biggest thing is we have a tendency to measure the data and the metrics that are easy to collect. And those tend to be output metrics.
Right. Sure.
How many people attended a program? That tends to be the be all and end all in many organizations, right, rather than the outcomes. What are the changes that you see, either immediate proximal outcomes in terms of mindset or intended behavior, or long-term outcomes and impact in changes to the perception of the workforce or real business metrics? So there tends to be a reluctance to measure the softer elements or the harder to measure elements. And they're oftentimes not harder to measure.
Right.
It just takes a little bit more thoughtfulness and a little bit more upfront work in terms of understanding what you even want for the program to produce in the first place.
When I was part of corporate HR, one of the things that, especially part of corporate compensation, and I wanted to do training classes, I would be asked how many people are going to attend. And then at the end, what they asked is how many people actually attended. And that was the ROI. It was all about, to your point, did it happen? And then how many people actually took it? It had nothing to do with the effectiveness of the training itself. It was always, did you actually get bums in seats to absorb the training? And I was always wondering why we didn't look at other things like, were performance evaluations done better? Did people feel more comfortable about their compensation packages now having their manager sit through training? Is that where you're going with this, where, our measures should be better even in the front end, to be able to hypothesize, we're hoping to get a return on investment in this way?
Absolutely. And, a lot of my thinking around this comes from my background in social and government program evaluation. Because when you only measure the outputs, you could be having unintended side effects of your program that you don't even realize. So a lot of work done in humanitarian aid, as an example, there's flaws around measuring whether or not the food or supplies was delivered,
right,
rather than measuring the true outcome, which is whether or not people go to bed hungry,
right,
or if they go to bed satiated. And when you fail to measure the true outcome and you only measure the widgets produced or the bags of rice delivered, you could be having things where, there's an unequal distribution of those supplies that you're offering, or it ends up benefiting some families more than others. And then those families become ostracized by their communities.
Right. Sure.
And then you've created a whole other problem that you didn't even intend to create through the program that you're having. And the same thing happens in the world of people and culture all the time. You'd mentioned program evaluation and the degree to which people improve their appraisals or performance ratings. That's one program that often doesn't get evaluated, because if you ask 10 people involved in the performance appraisal or performance evaluation process what the outcome of that program or process is supposed to be, you'll often get 20 different answers, not just 10 different answers. You'll get 20 different answers.
With usually very strong opinions on it as well.
Right.
And I think that's, to get back to your other analogy, fertility rates, they get judged usually on those social programs. Did you save people's lives, and did you enable people to feel comfortable with their lives to actually have children? We don't have such dire metrics in HR, right? It's, on the performance evaluation side, it's, did performance evaluations actually get completed? Which is, one of the craziest metrics. Of course, they're going to get completed. They have to get completed. They should get completed. Why? Because we want the manager and the employee to sit down and talk about that and make sure that the employee understands the expectations that the manager has. Well, we've had to get into a cadence, at least annually, where we're trying to make sure that happens, which sounds awful, right? Shouldn't that be something that's built into what a manager does? And unfortunately, we have to train that into and measure to make sure it's actually happening. Are there other examples that we have in HR where, why are we measuring this? It should be happening anyways, like hygiene. I guess it's measuring hygiene. Are you really brushing your teeth at night? I have to ask my son every night.
I mean, it can go back to things as simple as the metrics associated with the employee lifecycle, and that can go back to your employee lifecycle surveys, but even just the data that you collect along the way. Are you measuring whether or not somebody was issued a laptop, or are you measuring the degree to which they were able to actually access all the systems on that laptop and use them effectively on day one? Because a lot of these things aren't objective metrics. And in some ways, the quote unquote objective metrics are actually less accurate than the subjective experience. To use another social program comparison, sometimes when you're measuring things, the safety of women and children, using the official crime statistics aren't necessarily going to be an accurate reflection of how people feel.
Mm-hmm. Right.
A better measure is usually, do you feel safe walking around by yourself at night? Right. So to use that same analogy, rather than asking people or measuring whether or not people received a laptop, it's, do you have what you need in order to be successful in this role? And getting into that subjective measure that's a more accurate reflection of what you're really trying to get at.
Well, we so often default to the easiest. How do we count the widgets? Whereas we forget a lot of those qualitative pieces that you're touching on right there. Is how do you dig deeper to ask the questions?
Well, I was going to say it's a little bit like organizational hydraulics too, or whack-a-mole, to use another analogy, because going back to the performance management piece, what works for one aspect or one outcome might not work for another outcome. And so if your goal is to get a really good measurement for the purposes of paying people according to their performance and having a justification for promotion and compensation decisions,
right.
The things that work really well for that, if that's the intended outcome, might not be the same things that work really well for increasing people's motivation and drive to develop and improve over time. So that upfront work of saying, hey, what do we really want to accomplish here, not only dictates the design of the program, but it dictates whether or not what defines a successful program and how you measure the success of that. So yeah, there's the tendency to default to easy, but there's also the tendency to just go through the motions of doing things without necessarily thinking about the why behind them.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Like what you hear so far? Make sure you never miss a show by clicking subscribe. This podcast is made possible by Salary.com. Now, back to the show.
Some of the organizations that are probably going to be listening today have gone from having the yearly check-ins or the yearly performance evaluations to the weekly check-ins, where managers and employees are encouraged and, in fact, prompted to check in once a week to say, am I providing you everything you need? What's your feeling right now? What's your temperature? What's your stress level? And the manager will typically look at it. Sometimes they don't, but they're supposed to have that encouragement for that weekly check-in. And to me, it's kind of going too far, but I wanted to get your opinion on it, especially as we're talking about measuring program effectiveness. Is there too much feedback, or is there too many check-ins, or is it just all about employee manager culture in those organizations?
I think it depends. And that's always the right answer, right? Is that
it is. It's a very good fail-safe, yeah.
But, I think I've been in organizations and I've consulted with organizations where that ongoing check-in was measured by clicking a button that indicated whether or not that check-in happened.
Right.
But all that's really measuring is whether or not someone clicked the button.
That's right.
So you can measure whether or not weekly check-ins are happening, but do that 4 times a year, right? So the tool that you're using to measure the thing doesn't have to happen necessarily at the same frequency as the thing that you're measuring. And it's more important that it feels relevant. The whatever you're doing to gather that feedback feels relevant and it's in the flow of what you're doing. I use the travel analogy. Whenever I go on a business trip, which is happening less nowadays than it has at other points in my career, but I'll take 5 or 6 surveys on that business trip and not even think about the fact that I've taken a survey. There's usually a survey or some sort of feedback that's delivered at the airport upon arrival or check-in. I'll listen to an audiobook and I'll usually rate the audiobook at the end. I'll have an Uber or a Lyft ride or a taxi ride to and from each location, and I'll usually rate that. And then I'll order, Uber Eats or DoorDash or Grubhub and rate the quality of that. And it doesn't feel like these things are surveys, but they're feedback mechanisms that are a very easy lift because it's very relevant to the thing that I happen to be doing at the moment. And I know that information is going to be used. So I think that's the big thing. If you don't think this information is going to be used, it's going to feel a lot more taxing to provide this, and it will be too much. So it really goes back to how quickly and how meaningfully are you willing to act on this information, and what are the internal mechanisms that might make it so that people are just going through the motions and maybe not giving you the honest, candid response when you're collecting that information.
But Kevin, there's a big difference between the CSAT surveys you're getting from DoorDash, Uber, the audiobooks place, and the satisfaction survey or the employee survey that feels a lot more intrusive because your boss is either going to get it, and especially if you're a small group, it's attributed to you. And that affects your day-to-day, where these other things are much more anonymous with millions of transactions happening, which you're right, they may be read, they may be looked into. But at the end of the day, those are microtransactions. Whereas the one you have at work, you have to live with. And I guess my question back to you on this is, if it's not in the manager's psyche to take feedback with the intent of learning from it and getting personalized, you know what I mean, right? Then that feedback is going to be very different than a CSAT type of survey that you're getting as a text message after you've had a transaction on the consumer side.
I love that question. And I want to tease out a couple of different things in that. One is the component of microtransactions and how oftentimes the employee experience or HR world oftentimes doesn't collect data on those microtransactions. And, even though Gallup has amazing research that shows that 70% of the differences or variance in employee engagement scores, according to the way that they measure employee engagement, are attributable to the frontline manager. Well, that's great, but there's also a lot of things that happen in your day-to-day experience that don't necessarily link back to the manager, that are actually an IT issue, a legal issue, right, an HR issue. And so all of those micro transactions that happen should have owners and should have a component that's not just operational, but also experiential. And I think you're right. The stakes for those, and I think this is not a bug, but a feature. The stakes for those are a lot less personal. And I think that's a good thing, right? Because it's really just a matter of how do we improve these things so that people are more effective and can have less stress throughout their day. And then the part about the more intrusive elements around managers, I think that also goes back to this idea of program effectiveness. Because if you're using your employee engagement programs or employee experience programs are often thought of as the metrics that we're using to measure the effectiveness of things, but there's also a meta evaluation oftentimes that needs to happen, which is to what degree are we effectively thinking about and using these metrics? Are we using it as a means of accountability, or are we using it as a means of learning? And there's some really interesting stuff out there around the different mindsets. There's a really interesting book that came out recently by Dan Heath. Him and his brother have written some really great things, but there's a book called Upstream. And one of the things that he talks about is the way that data gets used in organizations that move upstream when it comes to problem solving. Rather than trying to solve the problem downstream, how can you get to the source of the problem and fix it at its root? And one of the ways of doing that is to regularly think about the data as a learning opportunity rather than a monitoring and accountability mechanism. So he talked about a huge change that happened in a school district that started really dialing in on its first year freshman students. And the way that they started treating the data was, rather than saying, okay, how are our students doing, and reporting that information in aggregate and using it as a way to say we're doing good, we're not doing good after the fact, and maybe even doing some finger pointing along the way, or asking about how can we change these programs. They would regularly sit down as a cross-functional team and say, how is this cohort of students doing? How is David doing? How is Dwight doing? And looking at the metrics in a more ongoing developmental way. And if we can shift our mindset in that way, and we can measure the degree to which our mindset has shifted in that way, then we can get closer to a place of having programs that are really effective.
So hard to get out of the task orientation mode that goes with those things. I mean, I personally feel it and have throughout my career. It's like, okay, I got to check this box. And without really thinking about the behavior and, looking at a different way of doing things like you've called out just now, it's hard. It is hard to get away from that.
It's also hard from a qualitative perspective to sit down and talk about how are all these hires that we've brought in over the last year, and what are lessons learned, because organizations, they're so disparate. They're so decentralized in many cases. And even the people sitting in the room probably have no idea who the others are. And so the qualitative part of it needs to be measured through those surveys that I'm sure you're more of an expert than any of us, either Dwight or myself. But the thing I wanted to ask you about this, though, is this a case, Kevin, where we need to start measuring? And I know you're going to say I'm overdoing it, but we need to start measuring, like the consumer side, in every one of the microtransactions. What was your experience as a candidate? What was your onboarding experience? Did you get your laptop? Did you get your laptop effectively and get training on how to log in, or how to actually connect to the systems you need to and get the links you need with the username and passwords if we're not SSO? So while I would love to live in a world in business where we can get together and talk and do the qualitative discussion, have the qualitative, would an alternative be to actually just measure the crap out of HR processes?
I think so. And I think that could be controversial to say, but I'm willing to say that there are a lot of lessons that HR can learn from your customer experience department, from your marketing department, and the way that those experiences are measured in the customer experience world in many ways are light years ahead of where we are in employee experience.
Absolutely.
It's a conversational process. I was looking at retail data for a large retailer, and when you look at their survey, it's so responsive that it doesn't feel like a survey. They have QR codes and kiosks set up everywhere, and it's very conversational. It's only one question, asking about the degree to which somebody would recommend. And then in response to that question, it has a tailored response that narrows in on what did we do so well, what can be done to improve. And then the text analytics within the tool picks up on keywords in that open text response and then will randomly assign 2 or 3 questions as a deeper dive to the free text response.
Wow.
And if you think about it, it's not a survey in the sense that there's nothing being pushed out to the consumer to prompt them to provide that feedback, but there are different channels and portals and listening posts available so that if somebody wants to provide feedback in that moment, they can do that. So, if you think about feedback as a conversation, it'd be really weird if there was only one person always prompting that conversation or in a relationship. But, it's in the EX world, it's often just a complete push. But what about all the passive listening, non-survey opportunities that are available through the things that are happening on Glassdoor and Indeed and Yelp and your internal message boards and chat logs and conversations with internal customer care and IT and HR?
So much of people's employee experience is now being shared outside the 4 walls because of the internet, because of Glassdoor, because of LinkedIn. LinkedIn probably not as much. I don't think there's kvetching or complaining on LinkedIn as much as there is on Glassdoor.
Right. Because
I think Glassdoor is more anonymous, much more anonymous than LinkedIn. And LinkedIn has all your peers, so they know it's you. But even Glassdoor, I think you can reverse engineer who it is. But that's not my point. My point is that the experiences that employees have on these platforms almost never get seen the light of day inside of the 4 walls, unless someone in HR does it on an ad hoc basis. Is there a way we could take it and measure it kind of like RSS and be able to bring it in, do the unstructured data analysis on the text, and be able to try and parse out what's happening where and be able to figure out how we address it?
Yeah, the technology already exists to do that. It's just a matter of applying it to this use case. And it's really just a matter of how do you want to structure it in a way that gives you a deeper insight into the information that you already have, and also allow you to generate new hypotheses and new things that you didn't even know, right? The problem with one of the problems with the traditional survey is that you're already defining the universe of responses and questions whenever you have a Likert scale type question. So those unknown unknowns aren't even in your field of awareness. But when you're looking at it from that passive qualitative point of view, there can be concerns that you hadn't even considered to ask about, and then you can feed that back into the more structured data set and vice versa. You can come up, sometimes you'll see a weird relationship between data points and you'll have no idea where that's coming from or why that's happening. And the passive qualitative component can really add a lot of color to that. But yeah, it already exists. And it's funny because, before the technology was here, we used to tell our customers, basically, you're doing it wrong when you collect the qualitative data.
How'd that go over?
People like me, the survey consultants, right? We would say, okay, well, you're not being specific enough with your open-ended question, or maybe you should only use this open-ended question sparingly, or maybe you need to ask more scaled questions. Sure. But with the technology, you could be really bad at survey design in some instances and still collect really rich data with the sentiment analysis and text analytics.
I think we're getting more mature in the way in which we consume data now. I mean, that's what data science has kind of grown up to be now, which is don't just kick out what we used to do before, which was, as to your point, it had to be structured or it wasn't good enough. Now we're taking so much unstructured data and making decisions on it that we can open the floodgates, use rigor, build our hypotheses, and be able to take the unstructured and the structured data and attribute it as such, put our assumptions in it, and we're making the right decisions, or at least we are documenting how we're getting to our right decisions based on that data, right, Kevin? I mean, you can be sloppier, but still get better answers.
Coming back full circle with like how you use the data and what decisions you make, I think too often we fall into that cycle of you ask a question of your data and you go have this structured data collection process to answer that question. You learn something and then you act on it. And that's the normal cycle. But sometimes it's also you can create a program, create an action, and then evaluate not only the intended consequences, but also the unintended consequences of that action of that program, and then use that to create the listening and understanding. So oftentimes, the decision, I love to give the example of, you find out that employee recognition has a relationship with customer experience, or you find out that employee well-being has a really strong relationship with customer likelihood to recommend and refer other people. So maybe what you do with that information is you create a whole new well-being initiative across your whole organization. I think that might be a little too much, because you're taking one piece of information and you're making a really big bet around that.
Yep.
And that's another thing too, going back to my social science background, like no matter how structured or rigorous your data science is, in most instances, it's going to be cross-sectional. And even if you're using really sophisticated analyses like hierarchical linear modeling and regression and all of that great stuff, it's still cross-sectional correlational data. So you can't make a causal claim about what you're seeing within that data unless you have a randomized trial, an A/B test.
Sure.
So maybe the answer for a lot of this stuff isn't launch an enterprise-wide program. It's how do we launch a really smart pilot with an A/B test and evaluate the effectiveness of that so that we can have something that's really good to go for the next iteration.
And again, coming full circle, the topic today was we're going into recession probably, and how do we get to a way in which we can justify pretty much our programs, right? And so I think what you just said is the key. If you want to support your hypothesis with data, run a good A/B test, run a good pilot that enables your organization to see, could it possibly be that once you run that pilot shows you which way to go. It happened before. We used to have this all the time. Then, while we were in a lot of growth mode, we kind of got away from it. So we're getting back to the stage where we have to prove ourselves, right?
Absolutely. And I think it's healthy. It's like, the cells in our body go through a process called apoptosis, where the cells that could become cancerous, if we're healthy and we go through some sort of period of adversity, those bad cells will die off. And that helps us in the long run because it could stop us from getting things like cancer. And I think, we have to cut out the cancerous in our organizations. They're well-intended, right? They don't know that they're cancerous, but there's sometimes a lot of fat, a lot of extra things that are being done. And I'm of the opinion that, better for program owners to start working on this stuff now before the mandate comes to you.
Right.
So that you can actively say, hey, where can we be leaner? Where can we be more effective? Where can we be more efficient? And there's a great natural A/B test that happened for a lot of organizations that had certain employee populations that went into and out of lockdown and went into and out of the office.
That's right.
And had to, experiment with asynchronous learning and virtual learning and in-person learning. And those are some sort of natural experiments or natural A/B tests that you can use to find out, hey, do we have to spend all this money on live presenters or travel? And if it is less effective to do it one way versus the other, how much less effective is it? And how much more effective and for what outcomes, so that you can start to have more informed decisions and you can start to, now, The big caveat to that is in most budgets, if you don't spend your budget, you don't get that same budget next year. but if and when the time comes that you have to make the cuts, knowing where to make those cuts surgically rather than with a hacksaw will be really, really helpful.
And I don't know if I could possibly add to that. I just want to say one thing. In an era where layoffs are a way in which most organizations tend to trim programs out, it's better to have your program evaluated for cut than you being evaluated for cut. And so proactively doing this work could potentially not only save your job, but also those of your colleagues as well. And so it's probably better to do this on a more proactive basis than wait for that knock on the door that Kevin was talking about. Kevin, it was a fascinating conversation, wonderful conversation, very timely conversation. And we really appreciate you being here. Dwight, thank you for being here as well.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And thanks for being with us today, Kevin.
Glad to be here.
And Kevin, we're obviously going to have you back for yet another scintillating, wonderful conversation again.
I felt like it was more doom and gloom this time. Gosh, that's
the times, dude. That's just the times. And we it's better to talk about reevaluating your programs than having the programs be so expensive that they evaluate you for being the sponsor of the programs.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's called throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah. And also not making dumb cuts either, right? Whether it's a person or a program, you want to cut the fat out. You don't want to cut the bone out. You don't want to cut the meat out.
Exactly.
Yeah. Cool.
Well said, sir. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.
And stay safe.
That was the HR Data Labs podcast. If you liked the episode, please subscribe. And if you know anyone that might like to hear it, please send it their way. Thank you for joining us this week, and stay tuned for our next episode. Stay safe.